Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today, we're going to be discussing a very important topic, the strategic partnership between Nordic countries in Africa, particularly West Africa in recent times. I'm joined by a very special guest, Elling Tjonneland. Elling is senior researcher at CHR Michelsen Institute in Norway. He has nearly 30 years of experience working on the Norwegian Nordic foreign policies and development aid. He's also worked on issues such as conflict management and peace building, regional cooperation and integration in Africa, amongst other issues. Elling, I'm very, very pleased to have you join me today, and I look forward to a very exciting conversation.
Thank you for inviting me, Michael. I look forward to this.
Great. So let's start off from, so traditionally, Africa has had maybe the US or the UK, or, as a bloc, maybe the EU as partners. But we've not heard so much about the Nordic countries' African relationship. What is the historical relationship between Nordic countries and Africa to begin with?
There is a long history of engagement, but what distinguishes the Nordic countries from other European countries is that there is no colonial past. So historically, the Nordic relations with Africa was shaped initially by missionaries, by explorers, and so on, and there was very little commercial engagement. So that implied that when independence to Africa came in the 50s and 60s onwards, relations came to be dominated by provision of development assistance. And that relationship originated both from a missionary worldview, let's help the poor. It was from labor movement, solidarity thinking, let's support the struggling peoples. And it was perhaps also inspired by a more conservative humanitarian thinking, which was also evident in Nordic countries. And all of this came together in quite strong support for development assistance. This also implied that or contributed to a situation where it was tended to be seen as a bit marginal. Africa was marginal in Nordic foreign policies. And commercial engagement, although it was there and it was expanding, it was also pretty small and marginal. So development aid thinking was important in guiding and providing the platform for engaging with Africa. I should also add that although there are differences between the Nordic countries, there was also and perhaps more importantly, much cooperation, even in some cases, division of labor between them. And certainly seen from Africa, the Nordic countries would appear very much as a bloc doing similar things in Africa. But that started to change in the 1990s, gaining momentum after the millennium. And the reasons for that, there are several. One of them is that commercial engagement became more important. Companies in the Nordic countries started to look for and saw business opportunity in Africa, although still on a small scale, but it started to emerge. Norway's case, for example, oil and gas, Angola, Nigeria, and so on. So that began to happen. Then another factor was the end of the Cold War, new global situation, which also implied that there was more attention to what was happening in the South from traditional foreign policy circles in the Nordic countries. And that started to accelerate after the millennium, when global politics, geopolitics started to enter, and Africa became a stronger voice in international politics. So suddenly Africa became important, and that was evident when all the Nordic countries, not only there, but it happened in the US and the EU and so on, but they started to issue their first sort of Africa strategy papers. In the Nordic case, this happened around 2006, 7, 8. All the Nordic countries came with their Africa strategy papers, and what was common to them was the emphasis that we have to look beyond development assistance. Africa is an important component, and we want to have a more holistic approach to Africa. A third factor is also important to mention, because that had an impact on how the Nordic countries also differed in approach to Africa in different ways. And that is that some Nordic countries joined the European Union, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway being outside. And that implied that the European Union also became an important partner for some of the Nordic countries, while Norway and Iceland were a bit on the outside. They could afford, it was easier for them to have a stronger independent voice, while the others would have to toe the line and work with the EU to a greater extent. And a new momentum, I think, with Nordic Africa relations came in over the last couple of years. And it culminated last week when both Norway and Denmark issued a new Africa strategy paper. The last one from these two countries and from Sweden came, 15 years ago. So now there are new documents, and they are pretty similar in many ways to the strategy papers that came just after the millennium. The emphasis is that Africa is an important continent. It's an important foreign policy, from foreign policy perspective, to engage with Africa. Africa has a lot to offer the Nordic countries, and the Nordic countries can offer much to Africa. And although development aid is increasingly is an important instrument in providing and promoting these ties, one has to look beyond development assistance. So there are calls and instruments set up to also stimulate cooperation engagement involving the private sector and so on. Furthermore, there are some new priorities emerging from the Nordic countries compared to the previous one, although there are many similarities, but there's a much stronger emphasis on climate issues.
Okay.
And that implies support for climate adaptation, support to reduce emissions and so on, often by the use of traditional development aid mechanisms. But it is also a strong focus in all these documents on support to the private sector and companies in the Nordic regions to engage, exploit business opportunities linked to the so-called green transition. So that is something that is a much stronger emphasis now compared to earlier. The other new thing is strong emphasis on addressing conflicts, fighting radical Islam, promoting stability, peace building, and so on, with calls from all the Nordic countries to both support the UN in these efforts, but also strong emphasis on supporting the African Union in their engagements. And finally, which is more strongly emphasized in a Danish document compared to the Norwegian document, is that Denmark is very preoccupied with activities related to stopping illegal migration from Africa to Europe. All of this comes together in a strong emphasis on the need for expanding and strengthening political cooperation with Africa, both at the continental level and at the country level. In the case of the Danish document, it was emphasized that we will now open up more embassies and we will dispatch more diplomats to embassies in Africa to help do that. That is not been the case in Norway, but they have more embassies already compared to Denmark. But they Norway emphasizes strongly the dialogue also at the multilateral level and joint action at the multilateral level. And running through all of this is concern about geopolitics and the importance of Africa as a result also of new activities by sort of new powers, China of course, but also Turkey, certain Arab countries, Russia, Turkey, and you name it. Yeah.
Elling, you captured. We must well just finish the whole podcast. This is a very comprehensive summary that captures everything. Like it's very comprehensive from history to contemporary times, and you've charted that trajectory and that movement. But there's some thing you mentioned that's going to come to. I'll take you up on that. So Africa relationship with external partners have always been one that is imbalance. It's always been one in terms of donor-driven, aid-driven, and whereas Africa seems not to have that sort of agency, but we see that changing. And you've mentioned the Cold War, end of the Cold War, and how the geopolitical shaping at the time also influenced how Africa relations with Africa. But we're seeing a new one. You've pointed out now the new geopolitics in terms of like what people are now calling the third scramble for Africa, where you see not only the superpowers like Russia, like China, you're seeing middle powers like you've mentioned, like Turkey, like UAE. You see all these powers in Africa. It seems increasingly we're seeing a new geopolitical ordering. So, you traditionally have the NATO, but you're seeing different other configurations as well. You're seeing the BRICS plus. It looks like the global order is going to this multilateral, multiple kind of like hegemony. In all of this, you've also kindly mentioned the shift in the Nordic kind of approach from development assistance to kind of more strategic. And I was reading the report from the Norwegian. It's the report from the NAI and NUPI,
Right? Yeah.
Where Shedrick, which is a very good friend of mine, and he's also been on this podcast as well, where he contributed to that report, and we're talking about the need to transform, like you rightly mentioned, from donor into one guided by mutually beneficial interest. In my own research, I've always said strategic interest is important. It should be upfront and say, this is our interest. There's nothing to be ashamed about it, but how do we marry that interest with the interest of Africa? So it doesn't look like. So I guess my question is, what is the agency of Africa? Does Africa, in this new configuration of power, is Africa expressing that agency? Because a lot of people seem to be cutting Africa's power. You see, U.S. Russia summit, U.S. China Africa summit. There's this strategy papers. What is the actual scale of Africa's importance? Is he inflated? Is he really important? And how does the Nordic sees it up? There's another question I'm going to ask following this. So, but first of all, what is the scale of this African power or influence? Is he real? Is it?
African countries are their increasing voice and influence is evident in a number of ways. Of course, perhaps primarily in the multilateral arena. They are a large share of the members of the UN and so on. So they are important in international fora. If you want to have a breakthrough on certain issues, it will often be important to build alliances with African countries to ensure that you make progress in advancing issues that's important also for the Nordic countries. So in that sense, Africa is important. Africa is important because if you look down the road and look at population growth and look at the potentials of the African market and look at Africa as a source for a range of new critical strategic minerals, Africa is important. If you look at bilateral engagement, even the traditional aid engagement, the Nordic countries might have their strong views on what should be done and how development aid money should be spent. But now they are meeting much more confident African leaders. Not in all countries, not at all everywhere, but it's very noticeable. And they will say, no, thank you. We want cooperation in this field, not that field. And then you have to start to negotiate. And a small anecdote, there was once an ambassador from a Nordic country complaining to me, you've been posted there, second posting in the country. And he said, in the past, when we wanted to see the prime minister or the president, I could just pick up the phone and a meeting would be arranged the next day or the same day. These days, when I make that phone call, he'll be too busy. And maybe I'll be lucky to see him, 1 or 2 weeks down the road. So that is also a very striking illustration of how things are changing. And then, of course, the global politics intervenes. Nordic countries are, of course, also concerned. they're not worried about China's commercial or aid engagement in Africa, but they are worried about, will this mean that political alliances will be built, which also weakens our Nordic position in global politics.
Very interesting that you mentioned that. So what we've seen in recent times, what has happened in the Sahel, and we've seen the retreat of traditional, conventional Western partners, most especially France, and then maybe the United States. And that has left a kind of like a gap, a very striking gap, where other partners are filling in, like Russia with its Wagner group. And then you said China as well filling, and maybe Iran as well. You could see other people filling into other places. Now, in the past, when I've spoken to some of the Western, the Western have also been able to accept some of the feelings that from the Western parts, how they've dealt with maybe conflict resolution in the Sahel, and there, so they could understand. So yes, we could have done better here, and we're part to blame for this breakdown in relationship. So, but also on the side of it, people have always been calling for Western government, Western countries like the Nordic, like Canada, that have, like you mentioned when you started, that have no troubled historical past, like colonial stuff, and to mediate, to come in, without all this baggage of that. How well do you think, is that within the thinking of this renewed Nordic relationship? And how well do you think the Nordic countries can correct that and reshape Africa, relationship with the West?
Well, that's an important issue. I think if you look at what the Nordic foreign ministries and the senior officials are saying, and if you read the documents running through all of this, is that the Nordic countries, they're like-minded countries. They have a proud history of working with Africa. They don't have the colonial baggage, and they have, and I think, an image in Africa, or a certain reputation, that we are committed to Africa, we stay, we have a long-term perspective, we are somewhat more altruistic, not driven purely by commercial and domestic interests in the Nordic countries. And that is a strength which I see that Norwegian foreign or Nordic foreign policy makers, they identify as an asset which can be used, and it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should, maintain those strong relations. But then there are challenges, within the Nordic countries. How should I do this? In the past, there was close Nordic cooperation in engaging with Africa. That is still a case, but it's not as comprehensive as it used to be. Most Nordic countries would have found other Western or multilateral agency that they work much closer with. Some Nordic countries work closely with the European unions, others with the World Bank, UN agencies, and so on. There's not that much cooperation between the individual Nordic countries anymore. They still, of course, there is still frequent meetings between the Nordic senior foreign policy officials, and they've tried to institutionalize an informal engagement with Africa through annual meeting between a select group of African foreign ministers and Nordic foreign ministers. Very informal grouping. They meet over 1 or 2 days and discuss informally. Relations are being established, and it has been turned out to be quite found useful and viable. I mean, foreign ministers show up and they meet every year. There has been quite much agreement about who should be invited, because this is a small forum, informal forum. Should you only invite your friends, your main partner countries, or should you also invite leaders of countries where you are engaged but which are problematic, say countries in the Sahel, and so there has been some changes from year to year, but they managed to keep that forum alive. And I think it has certainly been important for the Nordics, because that means that foreign ministers, Africa is on their agenda, and that is an important achievement to ensure that they spend time and that they engage, so that is one important outcome of this Nordic Africa Foreign Ministers meeting, but it's still at a small scale. It would never be able to replace, say, the big events organized by the US or by China or Turkey, or they will have these regular Africa forums. But as a small informal forum, it's certainly important for the Nordic countries. And I think when Norway, for example, was a member of the Security Council until recently, and now it's Denmark taking up a position, I think a very striking thing there is the strong emphasis they played on building alliances and working with the African members of the Security Council. Sometimes working together on resolutions, being pen writers on key issues, and so on. And that is, I think, very important, because, I mean, if you look at what the Security Council is doing, I mean, half of all the resolutions adopted, are dealing with Africa. So I think that's an important arena where the profile plays itself out.
Yeah, very interesting. You mentioned, I'll come back to the UN Security Council and Africa's campaign or ambition to be in the permanent seat and the Norwegian stuff. But you've mentioned the annual meetings of the foreign ministers, which is quite informal, but it's more diplomatic. And a lot of people have been saying a diplomatic solution might be more effective than the usual engagements, UN, sanctions or meetings and all of this stuff that I already mentioned. Now, speaking of that foreign ministers visit, we recently had the foreign ministers his first historic visit in West Africa, visiting Nigeria and Ghana. I think in the past there's been a more robust relationship between the Nordic countries and maybe South Africa, maybe in other part of Africa, but not this side of Africa. What is the interest, or what has changed in this new thinking of dealing with ECOWAS and West Africa kind of? What was he offering? What's the thinking behind this expansion towards?
Well, as you said, historically, beginning in the 60s and until about 20 years ago, the Nordic engagement was very much dominated by engagement, predominantly development aid, but also politically, commercially, and so on, with Southern Eastern Africa and with the Horn of Africa. That has started to change 15, 20 years ago, partly as a result of Nordic thinking about a more holistic approach to Africa, and engagement with Pan-African institutions. And Nigeria was, of course, it's a big power in Africa. So there's always been embassies and political engagement with Nigeria, but with the growing instability in the Sahel and the Lake Chad, Nigerian and other countries became more important, and then there was the strong commercial dimension, which also made Nigeria important. And then Ghana has always been important for historical reasons, and also as an example of how you could provide development support through other means than just development aid, but also mobilizing the private sector and so on. And this has since expanded. Now it has been the Nordic countries, I mean Sweden and Denmark, will have decided just to close their embassies in Mali and Burkina Faso, and that will be shifted to Dakar. Norway did that last year, closed its embassy in Mali and relocated it to Senegal. And now, for the first time, I think all the Nordic countries, Finland has had an embassy there for a long time, but now all Nordic countries will now have an embassy in Senegal, primarily because of the Sahel, and that will be the anchor for engaging with Sahel. But I think the main reasons for the expansion in West Africa has partly been driven by commercial interests, and then increasingly with issues related to the conflict in Sahel. Because Sahel, for all the Nordic countries, or at least for the main ones, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Sahel became very important countries for development assistance and for peace building and for the end of migration and so on to engage with. So that is explains.
Yeah, you mentioned peace building. So one of the key areas where the focal points for Nordic relationship, it's because there can be the commercial interest can be realized if there's insecurity. So peace and security is very, 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 very key in that relationship. And the Nordic countries have been supporting the AU peace and security architecture, but another AU or that is non-government civil societies venture UN peace, but we've stated that conflict persists despite all of this kind of like support and engagement. Why do you think because I think the Nordic countries pledge about from the report $4.6 billion I think within 10 years from 2012 to 2021 in terms of development aid to support peace and security building in Africa, but that has not yielded so much. How do you assess that support in terms of peace?
I think it's important, of course, that they engage on peace and security. They have been doing it for a long time, and it has been manifested in support in different ways, but partly through support for the UN peacekeeping operations, and decreasingly by providing soldiers from the Nordic countries, but by providing police officers, supporting civilian capacity, integrating peacekeeping into UN mediation efforts, UN resident representatives in those countries. That has been one arena where all the Nordic countries have been very active. And then for the EU members, or the Nordic EU members, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, much of the support has been channeled through the EU's peace facility and the EU's peace efforts. And then at the bilateral level, there has been direct support for efforts by regional, sub-regional organizations to strengthen their capacity to engage with those issues, under the auspices of the umbrella of the African peace and security architecture. And there has been much support to that process. It sort of started off originally with in Southern Africa with SADC in the 90s, gradually shifted to the AU, and then ECOWAS was considered a very important regional institutions. There's sort of all of these institutions, they have the limitations, they are struggling, and there are setbacks and so on. But the commitment to support them directly and through NGOs and academia and so on are maintained in policy documents from all the Nordic countries. What is even more emphasis now in the most recent documents from last week is that there will be much effort in ensuring that the UN provides increased financial support to AU's peace support operations.
Good.
So that is a
Okay.
one thing the Nordics common here.
Let me come to the conclusion, and as this is going to be two-layered question. So you mentioned the Nordic countries' support for the African ambition towards the UN, reforming the UN Security Council. We've seen recently the Secretary General has called for Africa having like a permanent seat in the UN Security Council, and you've also talked for more funding for, like, last statement, and for UN more funding for this. I've also seen, when you mentioned climate change beforehand, talking green transition, there's also been people that have argued that Africa has contributed less to climate change, so it's entitled to like financing, to deal with this. So in all of that, how do you see the Nordic relationship helping Africa achieve all this ambition, and how do you think the relationship between Nordic Africa the second level, how do you think it can be improved in order to achieve, for both parties to achieve their strategic interest? To conclude with,
there is no easy answer to that. From the Nordic side, I would there is a strong political commitment to work towards strengthening ties, as illustrated with policy documents that came out last week in the case of Norway and Denmark, and then 15 years ago they had a previous version. It has the challenge is it's an important document, and they are considered important when they are released. But 2 years down the road, they may have been forgotten by the Nordic countries. So that's an internal Nordic discussions. How do we ensure that we manage to work on all the promises and commitments that we are making towards Africa? So that's one side to it. And then this is important also for achieving that objective, is that Africa must also put demands on the Nordic countries. They must also, and they are doing that, but they could do more. They are moving away from the previous role as being passive recipients of welfare money and aid from the Nordic countries. Now they are actors. And although the US and the EU and China are more important and bigger players, the Nordic countries are also actors on the global scene. And when it comes to North-South relations, I think we have been able to, what is the expression, punch below our weight, and we have a say. And both Norway and both the Nordic countries and Africa might find it beneficial to strengthen the ties and also work together at the multilateral arena.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you very much, Elling. This is a very exciting conversation as I envisaged. Very rich. We really appreciate your very, very deep insight and into this topic, and hopefully, I share the same optimism, and hopefully we can have a better world, a better, safer, and prosperous world. And we're grateful, and I'll keep you posted definitely once this airs, and you help to share among your network so that people can benefit from the insight. Yeah. Thank you very much, Elling, and have a very brilliant, beautiful day.
Thank you, and
hopefully it stopped raining now.
No, it hasn't, but it will, I hope.
All right. You too, give
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for tuning in today for another inspiring and exciting topic on the Nordic country's strategic partnership and relationship with Africa. Join me as usual to thank our guest, Elling Tjonneland, for his very rich views and insight into this conversation. As usual, I invite you to stay with us. Join me next week for more exciting and interesting topic. For now, stay blessed and have a lovely week.